Okay, why don't we call to order the Wednesday, February 21st, 2018 meeting of the City of Santa Barbara Creeks and Watersheds Advisory Committee. And would you call the roll to make sure that a legal quorum is present?
Mr. Moldaver? Here. Ms. Weber? Here. Ms. Owens? Here. Ms. Close?
Here.
And Ms. Lomas? Here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. A quorum being present, why don't we go to item number 3, consideration of the draft minutes from the January 17th, 2018 meeting, which is part of the packet. Are there any corrections, additions, or amendments to the draft minutes, or is there a motion to accept them as submitted?
I'll make that motion.
Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
All right, it's been moved and seconded to accept the draft minutes from January 17th, 2018 as submitted. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Are there any abstain? Okay, one abstention. So the minutes are adopted 4-0 with one abstention. Thank you very much. Mr. Benson, are there any adjustments to the published agenda for tonight's meeting?
No adjustments.
Okay, that brings us to item number 5, public comment. Any member of the public who wishes to bring an item before the committee that is not elsewhere on the agenda can come forward and be recognized for 2 to 3 minutes. Are there any people in the audience who wish to add anything? Are there any members of the committee who wish to add anything? Well, I guess that would be number 6, committee communications. All right, last chance for public comment under the Ralph M. Brown Act. Seeing none, there is no public comment today, which brings us to item number 6, committee member and staff communications. No communications from staff. Are there any communications from any member of the committee on a germane subject not on the agenda? I would like to remind people who are watching that if you were not able to see Professor Ed Keller's talk about the geology of the South Coast and the alluvial fans of the creek system and how they relate to rainfall and debris flows and floods, that was sponsored by Eddie Harris and the Urban Creeks Council and the Citizens Planning Association 2 or 3 weeks ago. His talk is available online at the library website. You can stream the entire meeting, and he's also posted all his maps and charts from that meeting. I know that there was a lot of interest in what he had to say, especially about the hydrophobia of the foothill soils for the next 2 to 5 years before pre-fire porosity begins to be restored, which means some absorption from winter weather. And so please go to the Santa Barbara Public Library website, and you can pull down from the menu on recent programs, and you'll find Professor Ed Keller's talk a couple Thursdays ago. That brings us to item number 7, business items. The first one is post-construction stormwater best management practices installed in the public right-of-way, and that will be a presentation by Jim Rumbley from the Creek staff. So, Jim?
Thank you. I'll start off by covering some definitions, then we'll move into some requirements for installing BMPs in the right-of-way. We'll then go to some recently installed projects that meet Tier 3 requirements in the right-of-way. We'll then cover some different types of post-construction BMPs in the right-of-way, and we'll finish off with a recent episode of Inside Santa Barbara focused on BMPs in the right-of-way. BMPs can be defined as best management practices for stormwater treatment. They include permeable pavement, bioswales, bioretention planters, underground infiltration chambers, and dry wells. Really, you can think of these as low-tech ways to get water back into the ground. They can all be installed in the public right-of-way, or public row, as we commonly call it. And this is just city-controlled property, often reserved for transportation purposes, and it includes streets, gutters, parkways, driveway aprons, and sidewalks. The purpose of stormwater requirements in the public right-of-way is the same as for private parcels. It's to remove pollutants from stormwater falling on impervious area and to make development more water quality friendly. Not all projects proposed in the right-of-way are required to meet stormwater requirements. Only discretionary projects are required to meet stormwater requirements. So this is in contrast to a ministerial project or a staff-approved project. Discretionary review includes Single-Family Design Board, Architectural Board of Review, Historic Landmarks Commission, Staff Hearing Officer, and Planning Commission. If your project needs to go to any of those and it proposes at least 1 square foot of new or replaced impervious area in the right-of-way, it's going to have to do stormwater requirements. So Tier 2 requirements kick in between 1 and 500 square feet of new or replaced impervious area. A Tier 2 project is really a demonstration project. Hopefully, it's more than that, but at a minimum, just one of the BMPs has to be installed. So Tier 3 projects, on the other hand, that's when more than 500 square feet or more of new or replaced impervious area is proposed. And that involves treating a 1-inch 24-hour storm for a specified project site. In contrast to a private parcel Tier 3 project where the entire parcel has to be treated, since the public right-of-way encompasses the entire city, when Tier 3 is triggered, you don't have to do the entire city for stormwater treatment. There's a set project area that's determined on a case-by-case basis for that project. Some recent Tier 3 projects in the public road that you might be familiar with: Las Positas Road Cliff Drive Roundabout, the La Cumbra Road Sidewalk Infill Project, the Old Coast Highway Sidewalk Infill Project, and all upcoming bridge replacement projects. Those are all Tier 3, and they installed extensive BMPs in the right-of-way that are treating a lot of road runoff. Next, we'll talk about the different types of BMPs that can be installed in the right-of-way. One type of BMP that we're pretty excited about are dry wells. We don't have any of these installed in the right-of-way yet, but these are large underground concrete chambers. They fill up with stormwater. We install them over gravel and a really sandy soil to get a high infiltration rate. And one kind of caveat on these is that they have to be installed where groundwater is really deep. We can't install them where groundwater is shallow because there's not enough treatment that happens, and we don't want to pollute the groundwater. So we're really looking for a minimum of 30 feet from street level to groundwater, but preferably much more, 50, 80, 100 feet to groundwater. So with a dry well, you can capture and treat a really large volume of stormwater runoff, up to 2 acres of impervious area and 5 acres of landscaped area for up to 7 acres total of stormwater treatment. As I mentioned, no dry wells currently in the public right-of-way, but the Creeks Division is planning to do a pilot project where we install 2 dry wells in the public right-of-way to see how they work. We have high hopes. We're thinking that they're going to be a really efficient use of space in the right-of-way. Very small footprint. You won't see much on the surface. You might see a couple manholes and an inlet for stormwater to flow into. But all of it's underground, and there's a lot that happens underground. We'll get to that in a minute. We're also hoping that it's a low cost per acre of stormwater treatment. I mentioned, up to 7 acres. We're not sure on the cost yet, but we'll have a better idea after the pilot project. But we're thinking it's going to be a pretty efficient stormwater treatment cost. As an added bonus, groundwater recharge and improved creek and ocean water quality come along with dry wells. Here's a schematic looking underground of a dry well. At the top is the street level, and on the left you have a smaller chamber. And this is kind of a settling basin. Stormwater enters into this first basin, sediment settles out, some hydrocarbons are removed, and then stormwater will flow across through this pipe to the dry well. And this dry well, it's a concrete chamber. It's about 20 feet deep, and water can pool up. And the higher that water gets, the more the head pressure we have, and that water is going to be pushed down into that gravel layer and down into some really sandy soil and infiltrate. This gravel layer below, it can be pretty deep. We might get, depending on how deep groundwater is, we might get 30, 40, 50 feet of gravel and get a lot of treatment, a lot of storage. Permeable pavers are another type of BMP that's commonly installed in the right-of-way. The Creeks Division has installed a lot of these all over town. I know you all are very familiar with them. We've got them installed on sidewalks. We've done alleys. And this photo on the left is of Quarantina Street. I think you might have all been out there. We've got 2 blocks of street that's done in permeable pavers. Underground infiltration chambers are another type of BMP. Public Works has installed several of these around town. This photo on the left, you're looking into a catch basin. This is an open bottom catch basin. And so where the perspective that the photo is taken from is from the catch basin mouth, where the water enters. And as water fills up, it can flow into this pipe that you see on the left. And although it's really tough to get a shot of what an underground infiltration chamber looks like once it's installed, I've got this schematic where you can see where this pipe enters. This circle in this chamber is where the stormwater will enter. And it fills up this chamber, and as that chamber fills, it also spills out into this gravel area around the chamber. So there's quite a bit of capacity with some soil below that's hopefully uncompacted, and we can get a lot of infiltration. Permeable concrete is another BMP that's been installed in the right-of-way. This photo is of Lacumba Road, the sidewalk infill project. In the foreground, you have permeable concrete. Notice how it looks different than the concrete behind it. This is regular concrete in the background here. And the difference between the two is that there's less fines used in permeable concrete. There's less sand installed. So it doesn't look as smooth, but without that sand, you get really high infiltration rates in that concrete and water in that permeable concrete, and water just percolates really readily down through. On this schematic or this cross-section detail next to this photo, one thing I want to point out is the importance of the soil compaction. This particular detail has uncompacted native soil, but what we like to see in a permeable pavement installation is about a 90% compaction. If it's overcompacted, you really lose a lot of infiltration capacity. So we're looking for that loosely compacted soil that's also stable but not overly compacted. Here's a photo of a bioretention planter. This was taken at the new roundabout at Las Positas and Cliff. And this particular planter, it has a lot of capacity to take on street runoff. So this curb cut here in this photo, water can flow into it. The basin's depressed a little bit so water can pool up. But what's really important is what's underneath, the soil. In this cross-section detail, you can see that there's an engineered soil media that's really sandy. That media has a really high infiltration rate, so water can percolate pretty quickly down through and give us a lot of treatment and infiltration in a small area. Now I'd like to show you a video. It's about 5.5 minutes long of a recent Inside Santa Barbara segment focusing on BMPs in the right-of-way.
They're popping up all over town, surrounding new buildings, lining parking lots, and acting as driveways. They're all like infiltration basin and bioretention cell. They're actually a low-tech but innovative way to address runoff water quality problems.
So you can think of a stormwater BMP as something that treats runoff from stormwater. So by treatment, I just mean removing pollutants.
And the goal is to capture either retain or simply treat the water and let it run on.
Stormwater BMPs address pollution problems by slowing runoff down and allowing it to soak into the ground.
Capture the water before it got there. So we installed a new basin here that's going to catch all the roadway and driveway runoff, and some of the sidewalk runoff goes into the basin here, and this one has an open bottom to it, and some water will infiltrate through there. Then as it ponds up to a height of 1.5 feet, there's an outlet pipe that goes into stormwater storage tanks that are underneath the sidewalk here, and it will over time infiltrate that into the surrounding soil.
The third stormwater BMP used in the sidewalk infill project is more obvious. It incorporates a new twist on an old construction material.
So here at this intersection, we're at Via Lucero and La Cumbra, we installed pervious concrete ramps, and the infiltration rate for pervious concrete is incredibly high. Pretty much everything that hits it is going to go straight through. And we're also capturing some of the runoff from the sidewalk here and here, as well as this off-site, which was unintentional, but it's going to treat all that area as well.
In response to more stringent statewide stormwater runoff regulations, most new development, whether public or private, now needs to incorporate some sort of BMP.
We're required to install these whenever somebody wants to build something over a certain size, and there's design review required. That's the regulatory issue. The other issue is we have an impervious area problem in the city, and the idea behind stormwater treatment is to alleviate some of that impervious area issue. When you have too much impervious area, stormwater flows off too quickly and enters the creeks and ocean untreated, which creates a water pollution problem.
And while larger, more complex stormwater BMPs can be expensive, there are really simple BMPs anyone can do for practically nothing.
We see a lot of residential projects disconnecting their downspouts, where instead of piping the water from the roof to the street, the downspouts from the roof are disconnected into a planter or the landscaping. And that can have a big impact over time on water quality. Just that simple measure.
The Creeks Division is continually researching new stormwater best management practices. The latest, known as a dry well, is about to be tested in a pilot project.
You can think of them as large cylindrical concrete tubes that are installed underground, and they take up very little room. We're thinking about installing them at an intersection at a couple places in the city, and it could really be a good method for public works to use to treat stormwater in the future because they're cost effective and can treat such a large area.
So the next time you come across a large public works project, look carefully. You're likely to find stormwater best management practices, and maybe some inspiration too.
This has been one of the first projects to implement these types of measures, and so it's a great place if you have a private development, if you're struggling with how to meet the requirements for the water permit. This would be a great place to come and look and see what you want to do at your own house.
So we had a head start, but we still have a long way to go. We've got over 20,000 parcels in the city, and right now our highest level of stormwater treatment, which we call Tier 3, where at a minimum you're having to treat all the stormwater from a 1-inch 24-hour storm for all the impervious area on site. We only have about between 200 to 300 of those installed. So when you've got a city with as many parcels as Santa Barbara, we have a long way to go. All right, that's all I have for you all. If you have some questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Are there any questions for Jim on the presentation? I've got one while my colleagues are thinking. The photo behind you over your right shoulder has about 3/4 of the city in there. And in terms of the elevation and the depths for groundwater where you could use dry wells, could you point out some of the areas that would be really superior candidates for future dry well locations?
Yeah, so the higher the elevation in the city, we're hoping that the groundwater is going to be deeper. Down low near the ocean, we're discounting those. However, any sites that we pick, we're going to test. So it's not going to be a surprise when we get out there with a drill rig to install a dry well and we find shallow groundwater. There's not a lot of information for the entire city. We have some depth of groundwater information, but there's not enough for us to feel comfortable just picking a spot. So we're hoping on the Mesa or in San Roque, we might get some deeper groundwater that would be conducive to a good dry well location.
Have you talked to the geography department at the university about some remote sensing tools that might be able to give you a better idea of where the water is below the surface?
I haven't talked to them yet. It's not a bad idea, though.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions on Jim's presentation on best management practices?
I have one question.
Natasha.
You showed the dry wells, the vertical dry wells, and you showed the one under the sidewalk, which was a horizontal. Can you put that in a shallower area? Can that be like at 10 feet? If the water table is about 10 feet, would that still work?
We would allow that because it would have some depth to that groundwater. We've in practice for the Tier 3 project, if they were to propose a infiltration type of underground system with that far to groundwater, we would allow that.
So you said all new construction has to incorporate some of these BMPs. Well, does that also include buildings that are being remodeled, refurbished? Will they have to comply with some sort of new system? Yeah,
it can mean that as well. So that would mostly be on a private parcel where you'd have a building. But if you're proposing enough square footage of new or replaced impervious area, that's the trigger, regardless of it's a new building, an old building, or just flat work potentially could trigger it. It's in some neighborhoods, the Tier 3 threshold is 500 square feet of new or replaced impervious area. Some it's 4,000. For commercial properties, the threshold for Tier 3 is 500 square feet. For multifamily, 500 square feet.
I love it. I'd like to see this everywhere. Thank you.
That was a great presentation, Jim. Really amazing stuff. It's I'm excited that's going on in our city. It's really neat. I have a couple questions. The first one is, how do you decide what BMP you're going to use? And the second one is, how much of your budget goes to implementing BMPs on an annual basis?
So for the Creeks Division, we don't typically just install them. We don't typically trigger Tier 3 requirements for our projects. But the projects we do are focused on improvement of water quality. But for the first question, we don't really pick or require a certain BMP. So if someone has a project that triggers these requirements, they have some they can choose from. And we have a guidance manual that talks about the different types of BMPs. All of them are in there. There's certain requirements for each one that they have to meet. So it's really what fits best for the project. Cost is going to be a concern, depth of groundwater. You have lots of factors that make the BMP the right one. And we try not to, when I review these projects, I try not to say this is what we want. This is up to the engineer to decide what they want. But I know we do demonstration projects as far as a part of our budget, but maybe Cameron could talk more about the amount of money we spend on these.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Yeah, as Jim said, the appropriate BMP is decided on a case-by-case basis on the specific conditions around the parcel. Some places we have contaminated soils, and we don't want to be infiltrating into those, and we leave the choices on that up to the design professional who are working on a specific project, and that includes our Public Works Department when we're talking about projects in the right-of-way. With regard to the cost and the Creeks Division budget, most of the money we've spent on this has been for demonstration projects. And in terms of a percentage of our budget, it changes year to year. It's a very, very small percentage, particularly because we've been very successful with grant funding for the projects that we've put in. So to date, we've received almost 80% of the funding for the projects that we've done in parking lots and alleys and streets and sidewalks has been grant funded. So over the last, say, 10 years as we've been installing this, I would say probably less than 1% of Measure B funds have gone to this type of project. And then other projects that we do with restoration just don't include this kind of urban coverage or impermeable surface, so they wouldn't trigger any kind of requirement to install additional BMPs.
Thanks.
Sorry. You mentioned the grant funding. Do you know how much in grants you've gotten to install these types of projects? That could put a number. I'm just curious also.
Sure. I don't have the specific number. It's a good question. I would say we're somewhere in the $5 million range. $5 million in grant funds.
But if I could follow up on that, you've raised a very good point, and I hope people in the hospitality industry and the public at large realize that because the voters approved Measure B, which gives us dedicated local funding, we are at a competitive advantage against every other community in the state, all things being equal, when we apply for a grant or a project, because we can guarantee that there's going to be a local financial commitment, not only to partially match state or federal or foundation funds, but also that there's going to be dedicated funding to make sure that monitoring and maintenance of the project after it's been installed and after the grant has been used is still available. So that money not only sponsors the kind of projects Jim is talking about, but it makes Santa Barbara and the South Coast area a tremendously competitive magnet for bringing in outside funds to do a lot of really worthwhile projects that the community might otherwise not be able to afford. So it's a really good question. Thank you. Were there any other questions for Jim on his presentation?
I have a quick one.
Okay.
Thanks, Jim. That was a great presentation, and it's really exciting to hear about all the potential for stormwater capture. I had two quick questions more on like the maintenance, and one on way back a few years ago, a Surfrider colleague with the Ocean Friendly Garden Program, Paul, was working on curb cuts on the residential. I don't know if it was on the right-of-way or if it was, I think that's considered the right-of-way, right, if it's on the other side of the sidewalk?
Yes.
And I saw there were some demonstrations of curb cuts, and I was just curious, is it an option for residential property or as well as a project, or does there need to be that basin design? Does it need to be part of an approved BMP essentially?
Yeah, so for a residential project, we would want the treatment to occur on the private parcel, not in the right-of-way. If there's some exceptions, but generally treatment that's triggered on a private parcel needs to be done on that private parcel.
So it's not really an option for residential property
Not
yet.
not really, not for a curb cut, but bioretention, absolutely, that would be an option for a residential project. We see a lot of those. They're cost effective. I mean, it's really just digging a pit and putting the right soil media in there
the right medium.
and directing the stormwater to it.
Excellent. My other question was just on like permeable pavers and the permeable concrete. What has been the the Creeks division or your experience with the upkeep and maintenance? Because I know that can be a challenge with sediment infill.
Yeah, if there's no runoff directed to it, the maintenance is minimal. The joints will, over time, clog with sediment. You can power wash it out. You can use a vacuum to get those joints clean. But where we found the biggest issue is when there's runoff directed to the permeable pavers from impervious area. So part of a parking lot that's asphalt, it runs on to some permeable pavers. Those pavers are going to clog really quickly.
Thanks.
And just I wanted to just clarify something with regard to the first question about people using curb cut in front of a residential project. And the way that this system is set up under the Federal Clean Water Act is that the city is responsible for all of the runoff that comes off the city, whether it's public or private property. Once it gets into the city's storm drain system and goes into the city's creeks, the city's responsible for that water and for any pollutants that it's carrying. So that means all of us are sort of responsible for the runoff coming off the city. And we can the city as a whole can face liability for that pollution. And so the system that is set up now is, as people are redeveloping these properties, they're going to be responsible for the water quality from their individual property. And so it's a cumulative problem and a cumulative solution. And we all share the right-of-way areas, the roadways and everything, but we need to be able to have that space available to treat the water that's coming off the roadways. So if the city were to give up all those parkway areas, which are public property, for private residents to use, then when we're redoing a street and we need to comply with our permit and treat the water that's coming off the street, which is a large volume of water, we've lost those kind of green strips that would be available to treat that area. So the way our permit is written is on the private properties, the property owner is required to treat the property or treat the runoff from the property before it leaves that parcel into the right of way. Does that make sense? Okay.
What I meant was actually curb cuts on the street level. Sorry, apologies. I think some of the design projects I've seen in other parts of the country were actually curb cuts infiltrating street stormwater. So I was more implying like the curb cut was in front of a private parcel, but in the right of way for stormwater treatment. But I can talk more with you guys about this later.
Right. Well, I would just point out that's what you're seeing here. On the other side of the sidewalk is private property, and but what's happening here is that the city is redeveloping the streets and the sidewalks, and so the requirements are being triggered for the city, for all of us, and so this is one of the BMPs that they're utilizing to treat street runoff, sidewalk runoff, and they are coming in, they are being installed in front of commercial properties, residential properties, and other places around the city.
I don't know if you know the answer, because it's one of the things that makes Mr. Buell's life infinitely interesting, but average unit density projects and accessory dwelling unit projects, do any of the incentives or requirements for these kind of things hold for those?
So for AUD projects, yes. If it needs discretionary review and it's over a certain size of new or replace impervious area, yes, for AUD projects. For ADU projects, or most of them, no, because they are ministerial. they don't need discretionary review. However, there's a few, I've seen a few of them that require a modification. They're requesting a modification usually for a smaller setback. And for a modification, you need to go to staff hearing officer, which is a discretionary review. So by going and getting that modification, that ADU becomes discretionary and it's subject to stormwater requirements.
And finally, there's a trick that usually only happens successfully in movies or in Las Vegas, but since we're in the middle of the worst drought in 150 years, if we install all of these things to work well, they're kind of predicated on getting some minimally normal rainfall, aren't they?
That's true. Yeah, we do need some rain for them to work.
Do you have any cards up your sleeve that can make that happen anytime soon?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay, I just thought I'd ask, but thank you for a great presentation, Jim.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. That would bring us to item 7B, which is the 2017 fiscal year Water Quality Research and Monitoring Program summary, which will bring us Dr. Jill Murray, who, for the benefit of the larger community, is the scientist on our staff who works on the water quality and what kind of organic and chemical things are in the water that we all rely on in our streams and in our beaches. And Dr. Murray will be presenting the fiscal year 2017 review.
Thank you. Yes, I'll be going over some select results from our FY17 research period, which was June 2016 to July 2017. I'm going to focus on some brief results from our neonicotinoid pesticide project, our pollutant load model selection, and then talk about the drought, which wasn't my intention when I set up the research plan. And it looked like we had 1 year of decent rain, but lo and behold, we're back. And finish up with next steps. So I've talked about neonic pesticides every year. We're in the middle of a collaborative research project. It's funded by NOAA's California Sea Grant program. And it's a collaboration between Creeks Division, UCSB, led by Hunter Lenahan, and also involves Eric Muller and Jay Means, and USGS, United States Geological Survey, with Michelle Laddick. And it's an integrated effort. We're doing the field testing. We send the samples to USGS, and I'll talk more about those results. And then UCSB is conducting laboratory toxicity tests and modeling the potential ecological impacts of what we're finding. The schematic here reminds me to talk about these pesticides. Neonics, and I'm also going to talk about another one, fipronil. They're systemic pesticides. So unlike the types that you spray on a plant and the organism the pest would touch that poison and be harmed that way, these are either the seeds are coated in it or the pesticide is spread around the roots, and then they're really soluble. So the plant takes it up and makes the entire plant tissue toxic to any organisms that chew or bite on that plant material. And to be able to do that, you have to make the pesticides really soluble. And so they behave really differently in surface runoff than some of the other pesticides that we're used to looking at. So this is a summary of the results, of some of the results from the last year. We intended to sample an early storm, looking for those first flush high concentrations, a medium-sized storm, and a large storm. This shows the dates on the bottom. So this is over the water year. The pesticide that we found the most often, imidacloprid, concentration is shown on the left axis. Those are really low concentrations. But the US EPA's chronic toxicity threshold is shown in that dotted line. It's very low, 10 nanograms per liter. And then up on the top, you see the rainfall, and the axis is on the right, so it's the inches per day, and it's kind of projected down, so it didn't overlap with all the data. So the blue dots are collected from Laguna Channel and Laguna Laguna Lagoon. That when we did a lot of this sampling, Mission Lagoon and Laguna were separate. And then the green dots are sampled from Mission Creek or Mission Lagoon. And so for most of these storms, we sampled during the storm event itself, trying to determine the peak concentrations, but also we sampled once a day afterwards, after the runoff ended, and then once for 1 week, and then about once a week for 3 weeks after that. And so what you can see is there's always a imidacloprid, whether there's a storm or not. The very first storm we sampled was the second storm of the year, very, very small storm. You can see that by the little blip on the rain on the top, and that's when we got our highest concentrations of imidacloprid. It's taking this material off of the surfaces really quickly, and there's not a lot of runoff to dilute it. And it stays above the chronic toxicity threshold for weeks afterwards. Then we didn't sample for a couple of months due to holidays and staff illness, and got back into it in February, and the medium storm brought concentrations up, but not as high. And then it was immediately followed by that really large storm in February 17. And the load of the pesticide coming off was very high, but the concentrations, because of the dilution with a lot of clean runoff, brought them down to moderate levels. But again, hovering around that toxicity, chronic toxicity threshold for weeks afterwards. And so if we look at all the data combined for the 3 pesticides that we found the most of, this is imidacloprid, fipronil, and fipronil sulfone, which is a degradate of fipronil. I've separated these in. I'm not going to go into all the details of these plots, but they're box plots, and they separate they combine all the data for all the sites that we tested, but separated by dry and storm weather. So anything that didn't have rain in the previous 24 hours was considered dry. And so you can see that there's concentrations of all of these pesticides above the chronic toxicity thresholds in the red lines in almost all of the samples. And even for the fipronil degradate, it seems to even be higher in dry weather, I guess, as this compound is transformed over time. So we already knew going into this winter that imidacloprid was very pervasive, but we did not know how persistent it was going to be and kind of what concentrations these aquatic organisms are exposed to for days to weeks. We still don't, these concentrations are very low. We don't know the ecological impacts yet, and UCSB is pursuing that, and hopefully we'll be talking about that with you soon. We're always trying to tie these results into outreach materials, and I think we need to do more. This is a pretty big deal, but tomorrow we are going to the Landscape and Barbecue Expo, and we have a poster directly targeting this and incorporating some of these results. Another topic that took up a lot of time in FY17 was the selection of a pollutant load model. This was a statewide general permit requirement, but our regional board created even more specific requirements and wanted every municipality to conduct spatially explicit modeling. There's just on the right is a graphic of what they're looking for. They're looking for small areas that can be described as having more or less pollutant generating potential. And then we are to try to guide our BMP locations around these model results. Excuse me. So we jumped in with a stakeholder process that the regional board hosted along with a consultant to develop a free model. It was touted to be free for all the municipalities that would use it, and Teller total estimate of load reduction. And there were also alternative models available at cost. But as soon as the stakeholder process was over, really, it was changed to be a several $1,000s per year fee to use Teller. So if along the way, the entire time we went along with the stakeholder process, knowing we were going to compare models, because we really want to know what's the most scientifically appropriate and cost-effective model for us to use. Even if we're required to do it, we still want it to be something that hopefully we can utilize. because of the proprietary nature of the models and lack of willingness of the consultants to kind of try our different comparative approaches, we weren't able to compare them. So we moved ahead with the Teller model, largely because we had already invested a lot of time with two really good interns from UCSB and creating all the GIS inputs that we needed for these models. And so we got the outputs back, and there were so many problems with them. Here's one example. This is the panel on the right shows kind of the western side of Santa Barbara, and where that yellow star is, that is a sub-catchment around Oak Park near Cottage Hospital that was really stood out as having very low pollution producing potential. So an area you would not want to put a BMP. And this just did not make any sense to me. It's a highly impervious area. And so it made us spend yet more time digging around trying to understand the inputs to this model. And it relies really heavily and incorrectly on some inputs such as soil type and land use. And I didn't even really want to print the models because I did not want to create this institutional knowledge that somehow this area was not worthy of a dry well, for example. It just wasn't. It was false precision to make it look like it had a scientific basis to not be as pollutant generating. So we developed a much simpler model. It's Excel and GIS based. We can run it ourselves. We can have an intern help us, and it's based mostly on imperviousness, which, as we just heard in the previous presentation, is really important when thinking about BMP selection. And with we really had to make our case, but the regional board approved that approach in FY17. And so our next step is to utilize that model to calculate our overall program effectiveness in reducing pollutant loads and runoff volumes, and then to prioritize BMP locations. And the last topic I'll talk about is the drought. I think this is the third time I've used this slide, and I just keep extending the length of time. Someone on the committee mentioned that it was the largest drought in 150 years. This says 10 times that. But what are the impacts to our local creeks? And this really relates a lot to the previous presentation. The tie-in, I didn't realize, I hadn't seen the presentation yet, or that really excellent inside Santa Barbara, but the tie-in is so strong. So here's a schematic of how rainfall gets to our creeks. So the rain comes, it can, it doesn't show the surface runoff, but of course you have surface runoff right away. You also have percolation or infiltration into the ground. Some of that goes horizontally towards the creeks right away, called interflow, and that produces some of our wet weather base flow, or our receding limb of the hydrograph. And then a lot of it gets into the water table. And that is what provides the water for our base flow all year, which is so important to our creeks. And you can see here, if we put a monitoring well down and from the surface into the water table, we can measure how that water table elevation changes over time. And there are dozens of these monitoring wells installed throughout Santa Barbara. They're not owned by the city. They're not drinking water monitoring wells. Drinking water is far deeper, comes from the aquifers that are below our impermeable clay layers. But these monitoring wells are installed anywhere there's a leaking underground storage tank or a site that needs remediation. There are, and then the state has an amazing big data set where you can acquire the data, chemical and water level data from all of these monitoring wells. So looking at one, you can really see how that water level changes over time. So this is a monitoring well located at Carrillo and Chapala. So it's in the Mission Creek watershed around Carrillo Street. And the brown is the depth to groundwater in feet. So the surface is the hatch line, and then averaging about 50 feet to the water level there, to the water table. And then on the bottom is the rain in inches per day. And so you can see from 2004 to 2013 that the water level hovered around 50 feet, drew down during the summer, was replenished during the winter. And then during this drought, it has just steadily decreased. We had a slight bounce in 2015, and I don't have the FY17 data. It wasn't available yet for this well. But all of our storm drains are dry. We have a permit requirement now to sample all of our flowing outfalls. There aren't any. The only flowing outfalls are the West Side Drain, which is really the headwater of Old Mission Creek, and it's really low, and this is February, and Laguna Channel, where it comes out from under the freeway. It's also really low. And here's a picture that Tim Burgess took just a couple of weeks ago of looking at Mission Creek at Ortega Street. This is not okay for February. This is really horrible. And we've got our short-term drought. We've also got our climate change. The map on the left shows that rate of temperature change per century for the U.S., and you can't see it with the lighting in here, but the section for Southern California is a shade darker than all of the other areas of California. And Santa Barbara really is right at the epicenter of this temperature increase. And then we've got the precipitation also. The right side shows the nighttime. The nighttime lows have increased 6 degrees since 1900. So it's really having an impact on our creeks. So now back to the presentation we just saw. We really have a scientific basis, not just for the water quality improvement of LID and infiltration projects, which is really hard to demonstrate because there's no outflow for those projects, and not just for peak runoff reduction, which is also one of the main reasons often provided for infiltration projects, but for maintaining a water level above the bottom of the creek bed so that we can have healthy creeks. On the left side of this shows a watershed that is not developed, and you get a smaller arrow for runoff. Let's see if I can whoops. So that's a smaller arrow for runoff on the less developed side, more water being infiltrated into the water table. And with the more developed area, much greater runoff with a lot less left for infiltrating into the water table. And we've seen this has an effect on the reduced flows have had an effect on our bioassessment or our measure of stream health that Jeff Brinkman has talked to you several times about. We're measuring here the average index of biological integrity for all of the sites that he samples. They're not just in the city. And he's categorized those sites by whether they're flowing during the year he is doing the sampling in the spring, or pooled up, and what their condition was the previous fall, whether it was pooled or dry. So for the most perennial creeks, the ones that had flow at both times, the index of biological integrity is much higher, averages over 40 compared to about 18 for the sites that had some intermittency, and really drops for the creeks that were dry for part of the year. And then he doesn't score the sites that were dry. We just don't sample them. We move on to other sites. You can't really score something as a 0 with his scheme, but they are 0. I mean, there are no bugs there. So these are the index of biological integrity looks at what types of bugs are in a creek community, and they're just gone. So we don't know. So even though we had normal rainfall in FY17, the drought effects continued. A lot of that runoff came in that one big storm, so most of it did not have time to soak into the ground and replenish, as we can see by those monitoring well data. And many sites have now been dry for extended periods of time in all of our creeks. And our previous bioassessment work Jeff has shown that we have rapid recovery from fire impacts. The creeks fill up with sediment, but then they scour out the next year, and things appear to get better in terms of the biological integrity. Same with scouring events. They might scour many of the organisms out, but they seem to bounce back. But we really don't know for the drought recovery. I mean, flying insects, can they come right back and repopulate? Time will tell. And we don't know what the ecosystem impacts are when you take this many insects out of a out of a creek ecosystem, how many birds are going to be impacted. Obviously, larger aquatic invertebrates and fish are going to be impacted. And we'll have, hopefully we'll understand that more later. And just finish up by talking about the next steps. I need to finish up some things with the report and get it on the website and make that available. We're in the middle of carrying out the FY 2018 research plan, and I did want to note that we added some storm monitoring to test the impacts of ash on water quality. And this was largely, we didn't have a lot of watershed burned, so we weren't, and we've done that in the past. We've studied the actual, erosion chemistry, but not this time. We were looking for toxicity and metals and pHs that would get into the water as the ash was washed off into it. And this was driven, for me, based on reading a lot of questioning on social media about why we had all these notices about not hosing off ash during the fires. And so we want some data to understand that more. And I'll come back to you in June with the next year's research plan. And possibly before then, you'll hear from Jeff Brinkman about more details of the bioassessment. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. A lot to think about, and a lot for Professor Holden to be reporting on in a couple of months. Just since we're broadcasting this meeting, and students work hard but don't always get credit, do you remember the names of the interns who worked on the project with you?
The one we have currently is Alvin Jung, and Dami's last name I was being forgetful about, which is why I did not mention it.
Okay. Any other questions for Dr. Murray?
I have a
Betsy?
quick question. I'm just curious if I think you said it was Teller, the modeling system was such a failure for us here. Have other municipalities experienced that, and are they improving it at all, or is that just...
I don't know the answer to that question because I really stopped. Well, the whole stakeholder process ended. I think there are quite a few municipalities that really had no choice but to go forward with it. They don't have staff that can try to throw together something else, or the documentation for Teller is, I think it's over 100 pages. It's really dense. There are parts that I had to read 10 times before I could even understand what was done, to understand what I didn't like about it.
Well, good consultants get paid by the word, so they were earning their fee. Any other questions for Dr. Murray? Well, I wish it was a more upbeat report, but very, very fascinating. And I'm sure the public is glad that trained scientists are looking at these questions all year round and trying to get answers as they affect city water quality. Just parenthetically, before we close down, you were mentioning access to GIS information before. When you were trying to get an alternative, a local alternative, did the conservation blueprint data that was made available last year, courtesy of the Santa Barbara Foundation and the Santa Barbara Land Trust, that will allow people to look at 3 to 4 meter square areas from the channel all the way to the county line, was that of any use to you guys? Or do you have more detailed information from other sources?
We didn't use any data from the blueprint specifically for this model, but I did review their, I think they have a water quality or watershed health index, which was very informative. But we had what we needed internally, and there was one public data set, the impervious layer.
Yeah, because I know Dustin was the local person who was doing presentations and I knew him from Bren, but I think the person who supervised the final creation of the blueprint was our old friend John Gallo from the Conception Coast Project. And even though he's up in the Bay Area, he's still trying to realize that potential. So it's one more terrific tool that actually, unlike the program that you used, actually is available for free to anybody in the county who's interested. And you can find that either on the website for the Santa Barbara Foundation or for the Santa Barbara County Land Trust, or I guess you could just use your search engine to look at Santa Barbara County Conservation Blueprint. And it's a really wonderful free tool. So thank you, Dr. Murray. That completes item number 7. Are there, Mr. Benson, are there any other topics to bring before the committee or time and place of the next meeting?
Just item number 8, and the time and place of the next meeting. We have a meeting scheduled right now for the third Wednesday in March, but we may end up canceling that meeting and using the time for our budget subcommittee to review the proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year.
I imagine there's a huge amount of surplus federal dollars for R&D that no one anticipated coming here, so it'll take extra meetings to find out how to properly invest it. Is there a motion to adjourn? Is there a second? All right. Now, depending on which of the 3 timepieces Jen uses, she can find the exact time that we adjourned. Thank you.